My name's Colleen Harmon. I'm the director in that department, and I'm very happy that all of you were able to take some much coveted time out of your midterm studying to come and join us this evening. You're doing a great job this week, I hear, and are going to continue to do so, but this is a well-earned study break, so we hope you'll stick around for the duration. Okay, tonight we have a special guest who comes to us from very far away. His name is Dr. James Sheehan. He is from Ireland. He was born in Kerry and is a renowned doctor there and a great friend of the college. He went to school at the University College Dublin in 1956 and graduated in anatomy and anthropology in 1959 and from their medical school in 1963. He did his training in the United Kingdom, where he worked with the designer of the first successful artificial hip and developed a keen interest for artificial joint design. So he went back to school to get his graduate degree in engineering and earned a PhD in 1977 from the University of Guildford, I think in Surrey, in the United Kingdom. He is an orthopedic surgeon in Ireland and has been since 1970, but there arose a great need for medical facilities in Ireland after government cuts in 1980, and so he orchestrated and became involved in the development of 3 modern high-tech hospitals there, including the Blackrock Clinic outside of Dublin and the Galway Clinic. And he is the president of the Legatus League in Dublin. And I am told that he spoke at St. Columcille in Ireland, our program each summer, and made quite an impression on our students there, which given the glorious countryside, its long storied history, and the beautiful literature, is quite a large feat. So we are very happy to have you and your wife, Rosemary, and I'm happy to tell you that they are celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary in November, which is wonderful. Yes. They have 4 children and 4 grandchildren. And so this evening, we are going to have him speak to us about how one is a Catholic in Ireland and the world in general, how to keep that joy in their life, that perseverance, that patience, and also keeping our eyes always centered on becoming more Christ-like, whether that be in medicine, in business, or in any other vocation that we choose. So please join me in welcoming Dr. James Sheehan.
Good evening, everybody. I can't say how honoured I feel to be invited to Christendom. It's been an absolutely unique experience for Rosie and myself, and we're so grateful to Professor O'Donnell and to his wife Cathy and to the faculty here for inviting us to spend what to me were life-changing days, the last 2 days. I never thought in my lifetime that I'd experience the warmth, the hospitality, but most of all to actually go to Mass in the middle of the day, to find the church full with both faculty and with students, to see most going to Holy Communion, a queue for confession. It's left a huge impression on us, which we'll cherish all our lives. Thank you so much for having me. I thought I was going to be talking tonight to a few students, and I'm very honoured to feel that there are faculty members here. So will you forgive me that this talk is based for students, not for faculty, so I'll be referring to what I'd like to try and help stimulate people to do with their lives after their student years. So for that I apologise. I've titled this as How Exciting Can Life Be, because I've been privileged with an extraordinarily exciting life. I really have had a wonderful experience in healthcare, and I wanted to share some of those moments with you, and also to give you a few thoughts about leadership in the latter part of the talk. I'd like to start the talk by a prayer of Cardinal Newman that I always carry in my wallet because I think it's very important. And if we can just say this short prayer together to start the talk. the Holy Spirit. Amen. God's created.
He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my vision for this life. I may never know it in this life, but I shall be told in the next. He has not created me for naught. I shall do his work if I do, but keep his commandments.
In the Father, and the Son, with the Holy Spirit. Amen. And I'll mention Cardinal Newman a few times during the course of this talk. You all know where Ireland is. It's a very small dot on the globe when you look at the American continent. We really have a very small country. It'll fit into a small corner of any one of your states here. The population in Ireland is about 4.7 million people, as against your population of 324 million. In America, you have 4.4% of the world's population living in America. We have 0.06% of the American population. And when I come out to a place like Christendom and I see the Irish influence that's here, it amazes me, because as a nation, we have propagated our nation throughout many countries in the world, but most of all in America. And I'll refer to that later. We refer to Ireland as the island of saints and scholars, and unfortunately that's an era that is long gone. And it's one of the aspects that I found so rewarding here, to see so many young people practicing the religion, because in Ireland we've had a huge exodus of young people from practicing their faith, and it's causing us huge and grave concern in the country. As you know, our patron saint, St. Patrick, and I was delighted to see our second window on the left in the church is St. Patrick. He came to Ireland, pagan country, in the year 432 with a view to introducing Christianity, and remains our patron saint. It's reputed that he was actually sent to Ireland by the grandfather of St. Columba, and St. Columba, as you know, is St. Columkill, which is your institute in Donegal. And St. Patrick was reputedly brought to Ireland by St. Columkill's grandfather. Now, St. Columkill himself founded a monastery in Derry in the north of Ireland. And he subsequently went from the north of Ireland, from Derry, over to the island of Iona in Scotland. And this, if you like, was the first Irish missionary. St. Patrick came from Wales to Ireland, but St. Columkill went to Scotland. And if you like, it was the start of what we call peregrinatio pro Christa, or emigration in adventure for Christ. And we've had a huge tradition in the early years of our Catholicism in Ireland to propagate Catholicism throughout many parts of the world. We have a great heritage of old monasteries, and for those of you who haven't been to Ireland, we'd love you to visit some of the old monasteries and to look at some of our heritage. St. Kevin in Glendalough. Glendalough is south of Dublin. St. Kevin reputedly spent many hours praying with his arms outstretched. And on one occasion, when he was praying with his arms outstretched, a bird landed on his arm, or in his hand. And he was so taken by nature that he's reputed to have remained with his arms outstretched while the bird laid his nest, laid his eggs, and the young bird hatched. I don't know how long all that cycle takes, but he built a monastery in Glendalough, and the monastery is in excellent condition and well worth visiting. But St. Brendan himself St. Kevin spent most of his time living in a cave. This cave is over the lake, very inaccessible, but he led a hermit's life most of his life in solitude, in very primitive conditions. Now, our first university goes back a long way. You might think that you have a long heritage of universities, but our first university was founded in the year 544 AD at Clonmacnoise. Clonmacnoise is central in Ireland on the banks of the River Shannon, our largest river, and it's a monastic ruin. Pope John Paul visited it and said Mass to the youth of Ireland many years ago on his visit, and it's a wonderful visit. St. Kieran, who founded Clonmacnoise, had a lot in common with Christ because he was the son of a carpenter. He died at the age of 33 after founding and developing the first university. So really it just shows what you can do in a short lifetime. Ireland is divided into counties, a bit like what you have here with states. And down in the south of Ireland, there's a county called Kerry, where I happen to be born. But Kerry was the site of the voyage of St. Brendan. Have you heard of St. Brendan the Navigator? St. Brendan was reputed to have founded a monastery. In fact, he did found a monastery in Kerry called Ardfert Monastery. And after it was founded, some years later, he was restless and he visited a high mountain peak overlooking the Atlantic now called Mount Brandon after St. Brendan. He looked across the Atlantic and he saw the promised land, and he decided that he would sail with a group of monks over to the promised land. He set sail and his ship ran into problems. He returned. He decided that he'd go and fast for 40 days and then set out the second time. And he's reputed to have landed in America about 600 years before Columbus landed in America. Now, everybody takes these sort of stories with a bit of a grain of salt. And some years ago, an Englishman called Tim Severin said he would try and replicate that voyage. So he set out from Feenet in Kerry, where St. Brendan set out from. This is the mountain that Brendan overlooked the bay, and we now have a statue there representing St. Brendan. But St. Brendan's voyage is reputed to have taken him across the Atlantic in various stages. It took many years to get across. And Tim Severin replicated that voyage.
Sorry. Yes, Tim, to get you some water.
Don't I have water, Tim? Thanks very much. So he replicated that voyage, and this is the sort of boat that he went in. He said if it's to be authentic, he'd have to use the same type of craft. So they recreated what they thought would have been most appropriate for St. Brendan at that time. It was made of lats of wood covered in hide and strapped together. Very primitive boat. And Tim Severin sailed the Atlantic with 6 of his colleagues in this boat and replicated the voyage. So it's not impossible that St. Brendan was in fact the first to cross the Atlantic. He returned to Ireland and many years later founded a further monastery and is reputed to have died in his 90s. Now that gives you an idea of how people sort of voyaged in those days. And I'm just going to bring you very briefly through my little journey, which is a very small snapshot of the life that I've been privileged to lead so far. We sat in yesterday at Professor Hickson's classical discourse on Macbeth and Shakespeare, and this is my little contribution from Shakespeare. And the reason I'm showing this is that I feel that all our life is a journey, and we've great opportunities during that journey to do different things, and that we shouldn't be set in our ways about just doing one thing. And I always had a theory that every decade you should try and do something a bit different. It doesn't mean that you're not, in my case, practicing medicine or healthcare, but have a different slant every decade so that you refresh your mind in a new way. And I've been very fortunate that I've been able to do that throughout my time in medicine. This is my 60th year in medicine, so I've had a long spell in healthcare. My father had a very ordinary job in the Dublin port. He was in a clerical job in the Dublin port, but he had a great love of education. His father had a stroke when he was about to leave, when my father was about to leave school, and he had to take a job and support his family. And he did that for many years, and then married in his mid-30s when he was able to afford to settle down, because at that stage times were very difficult, and he was supporting his own mother and the other siblings in the family for many years. But as a result, he never had the opportunity of third level education, and he had a great hankering for it. And to his credit, he put 5 of us through third level education. How he managed to do it, I don't know, because on very ordinary means, he managed to put us all through. When I graduated from high school, he asked me, after my results came in, which were very mediocre results, just enough to allow me to get into university, he said, "What would you like to do?" And I said, "I'd like to do medicine." And that was our entire discussion about my career future. we had no discussions with anybody. And he said, "That's great." He said, "I thought you might like to do engineering." And we never had any further discussion about my career. And I look now at it and I see how much time all you students receive in terms of career guidance. It just didn't exist in those days. I entered medical school in University College, Dublin. And University College, in that particular building, it's now the office of our Prime Minister, called our Taoiseach. It was the College of Science in those days. But it was part of the university, a Catholic university founded by Cardinal Newman in 1854. And I think that, to me, Cardinal Newman has a big influence in my life. And I'm delighted to see the influence that he's had in America, that so many places are called after him, and that he's held in such high regard. He has been made blessed, and I've no doubt that he will be canonized in the near future. And I think his motto for education strikes me as very much what your motto here is. You know, it educates the intellect to reason well in all matters, to reach out towards the truth and grasp it. And I must say, having sat in a few of your classes yesterday and today, that message was so clear to me, emanating from your teachers. I think it's a fantastic sort of message going out. I graduated in 1963, and then we have to do a further surgical exam following that in 1966, and was conferred in 1966 so that I could enter orthopedic training. Now, my professor at that stage, who was very supportive of me, called me in. He asked me what would I like to do, and I said I'd like to do orthopedics. Now, orthopedics at that time was a fairly crude science. This is back now in 1966. A lot of orthopedics was manipulation of bones. We didn't have any artificial joints. We had no plates and screws. But I liked the concept of the carpentry of bone, because I was very keen on woodwork. And I thought that the nearest thing, you know, I couldn't do woodwork on an abdomen or something, so I thought working with bones was sort of very suitable. And I'd been exposed to a fair bit of children with polio, where you did quite a bit of carpentry on their feet in order to realign their bones. So he said, you know, if you'd like to do orthopedics. Now, I was very fortunate in that I had graduated with very satisfactory grades, and I could have undertaken any specialty really was open to me. But he was quite amazed that I choose such a primitive specialty as orthopedics. And he said there's only 2 qualifications as far as he's concerned for orthopedics. The first is that you have the strength of an ass. The strength of an ox. And secondly, the brains of an ass. And he stood back and he looked at me and he said, I'm worried about your strength. So that really sort of brought me down to brass tacks. The orthopedic hospital was an orthopedic hospital in the country, and in those days, orthopedics, as I said, was very much associated with polio, tuberculosis of bone, and a lot of children's problems. Not much adults. There was no adult surgery at all, hardly, for orthopedics. So the orthopedics hospital were sort of remote hospitals in the country, where you had people lying in beds, very often wheeled out into the sunshine, and given what's called heliotherapy, where they got the benefits of the rays of the sun to counteract their tuberculosis. So it wasn't a very dynamic specialty. But the year I spent was a life-changing moment for me. I had an aunt who was a missionary sister in Brazil, and she spent 72 years of her life. It just shows, when you look back at the previous generations, what they sacrificed. She left school and entered a French order, and at the age of 21 went out to the missions in South America and spent her entire life, 71 years after that, between Brazil and Argentina. And I had a very close relationship with her. She came back once or twice when I was young, and I developed a very close relationship with her, corresponded with her quite a lot. And at the age of 25, I was in Kappa. I had never dated a girl. I was totally concentrated on what I was doing, and my aunt was praying for me for a suitable girlfriend. Yeah. And her prayers were heard. And one day, this person entered into my life. She was young, vivacious, bubbly, beautiful looking, and had a mischievous twinkle in her eye. And after some months, I gathered up enough courage to invite her out. And that was now nearly 52 years ago. Now, in Ireland in those days, I had another aunt, in fact a grand-aunt, who was a nun in Kerry, because we all had a lot of people in religious life then, but the custom then was that you really had to have your prospective wife vetted. And I don't think many of you would tolerate this nowadays. So she was vetted satisfactorily, passed with flying colours, and on the 5th of November, we got married. We were engaged about 6 or 8 months before that, but after I met Rosemary, I felt after a very short time that I really felt that she had been sent to me by Our Lady, and that my aunt had a very major influence on putting her in my path. And I decided that I would pray especially to ensure that we were suited for each other. And I decided that I'd say the stations. I don't know why I picked the stations, but I said I'd say the stations every day, maybe reflecting sort of the cross I was going to bear in later life. But I decided I'd say the stations every day. And the 300th day of saying the stations, I decided I'd take her to the Church of the Annunciation on the Feast of the Annunciation. And she was wondering why we were going there. And I said, look, we'll call in and we'll say a prayer. So we knelt down at the back of the church, and when she was on her knees, I proposed her. Yeah. that was the start of our most extraordinary and wonderful relationship. We emigrated straight away, and I went to work with Sir John Charnley a short time later, and he had a huge influence on my life because he designed the first artificial hip joint that really was satisfactory, and they're Charnley hips in a patient. And I was very impressed with the results that we achieved with hip surgery. Also, at that time, a Swiss group of people were developing bones and plates, and that's the sort of thing that was evolving at that time, that if people had bad fractures, you put in a multiplicity of screws and plates to reconstruct the bone. I didn't know much about the mechanics of the scene, and I decided in order to learn that I should really go back to college again. So I went back to the University of Surrey and did a short course in engineering, and then was affiliated with them for 7 years after that, doing a PhD degree. And that again was a very crucial stage in my life. After about 5 years in England, I was offered a job in Dublin in St. Vincent's Hospital, which was just opening. It was a newly built hospital, and we came back to Ireland in 1970. At that time, very little surgery for people with arthritis had been undertaken. And again, there wasn't much surgery for people with road accidents, with fractured bones. And I set up a unit in Dublin for artificial joint replacement in Kappa Hospital, where I had previously been. After some years, in 1981, that was 11 years later, the demand was so great that I had a waiting list of 5 years for surgery, and we just couldn't cope with the demand, because up until then a lot of people with arthritis were just sitting at the fireside. They had nothing done for them, and there were very few undertaking surgery. So I had a huge dilemma that there just wasn't enough resource. And at that time, the government, in their wisdom, decided that they'd cut back on healthcare, as happens every so often with healthcare. And they decided that people who needed artificial joints wouldn't get them because they weren't going to fund artificial joints, because they weren't life-saving. You had to do procedures for people who had an acute appendix and various other things, but you didn't have to perform artificial joints. So they said, look, we'll cut back. And I was virtually redundant. Now, at that time in Ireland, about a third of the population carried private insurance, which was not funded by the state. And I decided that if I can't do much in the public system, why don't we develop one hospital that at least I could work, and that others with similar interests. A colleague of mine who was interested in cardiac surgery and was very curtailed as well. So a few got together and we developed one of the existing private hospitals in Ireland called the Blackrock Clinic. This is a major adventure really, because we had no funds to do it, and it was with providence of the Lord that it evolved, and that we came out solvent at the end of it. Blackrock Clinic opened in 1982 and the hospital itself opened in 1984. We recently celebrated our 30th year. One of my interests at that stage was that the religious orders were all exiting from healthcare. And as you know, we had a huge tradition of the religious orders running our hospitals and our healthcare facilities. And the numbers were dwindling. They weren't able to cope with the hospitals. They were handing them over to the state. And I felt that why can't some of us with religious commitment develop hospitals, Catholic hospitals, preserve the Catholic ethos, and that the laity would take the running where the religious orders were letting up. And we've been very privileged to be able to maintain the Catholic ethos over the last 30 years by confining our operation and admissions to all conditions that are entirely in keeping with the teaching of the magisterium of the Church. Another view of Blackrock it really was a very high quality building, and it stood the test of time. That's the atrium of the outpatient department. Some years later, the west of Ireland was in need of a similar type hospital, and we developed a hospital in the west. Now, Rosemary and myself have worked together very closely all our lives. And it's been one of the great strengths of our relationship. She worked for a very short period in the bank before we got married. She worked, I think, for 9 months, and she was on strike for 3 months. In fact, I think she caused the bank strike. And the whole bank went out. But anyway, since then, she handled all my finances. I never had anything to do with finance. So that, for example, with the Galway Clinic, she wrote checks to the tune of 100 million from our kitchen table and managed all the finances, and subsequently for another clinic called the Hermitage Clinic, which we built 2 years later. Really she has made a huge contribution to healthcare in her own quiet way. So we move on another few decades, and I continue to work as an orthopaedic surgeon, and after a period I decided that why not concentrate my efforts in providing better facilities and improving the facilities rather than just continuing to put in a few extra joints into people. At that stage I had put in about 12,000 hip and knee replacements and operated, I reckoned, on about 100,000 people. So I really had a very busy life. And I must admit that as a husband, I was an absolute disaster. I never saw the kids. I worked day and night, and I really was eternally grateful to Rosemary for rearing our children, because I made such a poor contribution. Well, one of the great joys I've had in recent times is that my youngest son came to work with me in Galway, and we spent the last 15 years working very closely together. In fact, my 2 sons worked very closely with me in latter years, and it's been a great consolation to me that I tried to make up for my previous sins to some small extent. But I decided then at this stage, 12 years ago, that I would stop surgery and concentrate on running hospitals in a better way, because healthcare to me is not run the way it should be. And I would be very critical, not alone of what we do in Ireland, but in most other countries. I think that in America, I've visited many, many healthcare institutions. You have some of the best healthcare in the world, some of the worst, but your pricing structure of healthcare is absolutely disastrous. That it bears no relationship whatsoever to the service that people are receiving. And I've been very interested in the whole concept of lean healthcare, delivering healthcare at as low a cost, but at a very high quality. And I've got great satisfaction out of doing that for the last decade. So that decade of my life is now just coming to an end, and I'm stepping down from that and winding down my involvement in healthcare and entering the next decade at 77 years of age. People say, when are you retiring? And I say, that word doesn't come into my vocabulary. Now, one aspect of healthcare that is so interesting to me is that of all places to portray the Christian virtues, you can practice it more in healthcare than in any other area. And when you think of the importance of faith, hope and love in healthcare, where better can they be portrayed? And I think that we all have an obligation to try and improve the quality of the virtues that are practiced in healthcare, because a lot of the younger staff are forgetting about why they're actually in healthcare. Faith in healthcare is so important because everybody is going to die at some stage, and how important it is that people know that there's a life hereafter and that life doesn't end when their soul departs their body. Hope. I've a quote that Professor O'Donnell has quoted before that I love to see, and we have it up on the wall in the clinic in Galway. St. Paul's quote: "Sickness brings patience, patience brings perseverance, and perseverance brings hope." And I think above all, we have to give patients a feeling of hope, because people who may only have a very short time to live, their hopes are very different from ours. They may just hope to see the sunset or the sunrise the following day. So everybody's hope is different, and we must never take that away from them, because once you take hope away from people, they turn their head to the wall and their life comes to an end. And finally, love. Where better than propagating Christ's work with the sick, because he spent an awful lot of his time looking after the sick. Because if you actually look at the Gospels, what did he do most of his time? He actually wasn't preaching. He was healing the sick. And I think if you take that as an example of Christ's work, those of us in healthcare are very privileged to be able to continue to do so. Now, with that comes the responsibility of leadership. And how do we actually propagate the Christian virtues and have an element of leadership in our healthcare? My definition of leadership is the ability to influence just one other person. Because we often think of a leader as having a whole army behind him or a whole band of people. But if you can influence one other person in your life, you have been a leader. Leadership also to me is the ability to inspire somebody. Because if you can inspire and ignite a spark of sort of ambition in somebody, you don't know what that person can achieve. And I think as a leader, if you can influence one other person to really ignite that flame in them, you have served your job as a leader. Because people, when they're excited, there's virtually nothing they can't do. They can move the earth. And people don't believe how much they can achieve. And I think for those of you who are students and moving on to greater things in your life, look at life as, you know, you've been given a fantastic opportunity with your education here. How can you lead others in your lifetime to do something really wonderful? As humans, we have two attributes that you must never forget. The first is the freedom to choose, because we all have the ability to choose. And you can choose to do nothing, or you can choose to do something wonderful. Life finds its own path, and I must say, having looked back, and I'm looking back on my life after 77 years, you're in the wonderful position that you're looking forward to your life, and you have the ability to decide what to do. But if you're working with the Lord and guided by Him, that life will evolve for you, because things will open up and doors will open, but don't ignore them. When they do open, don't avoid them, because great opportunities will present themselves to you, and none of you will know what you'll be doing the decade later. So we'll keep your options open from each decade to another. The second great attribute you have is you have the ability to dream. And Walt Disney said that if you can dream it, you can do it. You know, and we all get dreams at times, and sometimes those dreams may seem foolish, but sometimes we're being told in a subtle way by the Lord to do something, and to do something that may turn out to be something great. So don't ignore your dreams. I said to you that it's very hard to know what you're going to do in the future. There was an Irish man called Kevin Roach. I don't know if any of you have come across him in America. He's a very famous architect, one of your leading architects. He came from County Cork in Ireland, a place called Mitchelstown. Went to school locally, And when he left school, his father was a creamery manager, and his father felt that it would be very suitable if his son Kevin succeeded him in the creamery business. So he decided that he sent him up to University College to sign on and do agriculture with a view to going back to the creamery business. He went up, and in those days there was a little booth for each faculty in a hall called the Aula Maxima, and he couldn't find the booth for agriculture, and the nearest one was architecture. Yeah. Now, could you imagine such diverse varieties as those two? He signs in for architecture and he's one of the leading 10 architects in the world rated by Time magazine. And it just shows you can do it if you put your mind to it, but you have to work at it. Now, what sort of a leader would you like to be when you're looking at your life ahead? You know, what do you see? Because the best coaches will tell you that the teams that win championships are those that focus on the basics and not on a few great stars. So that as a leader, you need to be part of a team, and you have to work with that team. Now, 2,000 years ago, there was an unruly bunch of people got together. They followed an itinerant preacher. They were poor, they had no possessions, they had no education. They were just wandering around and following this preacher whom they believed in what he said. His great hallmark was that he was authentic. He was preaching and doing what he said and meant. And as a result, they intrigued people. And this group got up to 3,000 to 5,000 followers someday. They sat around, they preached, they broke up into smaller groups, and they changed the world. And I think it's a great example as to what one person starts and is propagated. And their truth and their goodness was really what made them differentiated from the rest. But they were authentic. So if you're doing anything in life, be yourself. Don't try and be somebody else. Be authentic. Now, a great example of someone being authentic is St. Francis. And I would be a great follower of St. Francis and what he's done. And I think our current Pope shows his name as well based on St. Francis as an example. St. Francis came from Assisi, from a very well-to-do family. His father was a merchant, and St. Francis led a fairly hectic life in his younger years. And in those times, wealth was accumulated because coins had been introduced. Up until that, barter was the way of trading. You swapped a few chickens for something else and that, but you couldn't accumulate much wealth. And around that time, coins were introduced and people became greedy. They started accumulating wealth, and St. Francis didn't like the concept. And he led an austere life, looked after people, very similar to the way that Christ behaved in his time. And as a result, he now has 1 million followers who have dedicated their life to working for him in the Franciscan order. So can you imagine the example that one person had? The other person that stands out is Mother Teresa, who's done the same. What they had was that they were both authentic. They didn't try to be something else. They led simple lives, but they believed in what they were doing. As they say, don't tell me, just show me and do it. Don't try and be someone else. The qualities of leaders, just very briefly, I'm going to just give you a few of the qualities that I feel are important in leaders, having dealt with a lot of young people over the years. The first one is intentionality. Intentionality means be focused on what you're doing. because too many people are only, if you like, half interested in what they're doing. But intentionality means really get down to it, keep life simple, and don't be disappointed if you don't achieve very rapidly, because sometimes it takes a long time to achieve anything. The bamboo plant, I'm sure you've all seen bamboo plants growing. When you plant a small bamboo, it doesn't appear over the surface for 5 years, because for the first 5 years the root structure of the bamboo is developing. When it appears over the surface, it grows at a few feet a year and sometimes grows up to 100 feet tall. So what's happening in the early stages is the roots are being developed. And it's the same with your lives. Get your roots developed, like here, and later on things will explode at a fantastic rate. In order to get started, it's one of the most difficult things to do. And when you look at the space shuttle, 94% of the fuel is used on takeoff. And only 6% left for the rest of its journey. So the actual getting started is the most important aspect, and don't be put off. And the other thing with intentionality is that don't be afraid of peace and quietness, because one of the things I find in this world is that we're all overcome by noise and bustle and all that goes with it. Try and find quiet places. When you read about our Lord in the Gospel, he went to a quiet place to pray. It never says in the Gospel he looked for a quiet place. He knew where they were, and he went to a quiet place. And I think we all need a lot more peace and quietness in our lives, like in Donegal, and escaping from the hustle and bustle of life. If I'm not holding you too long, I'd just like to tell you a short story about a man called Dick Drew, because to me, as a leader, try and do something that's different, that's groundbreaking. This man, Dick Drew, worked for a company called 3M. You've all heard of 3M, the Minnesota mining company, founded in the early part of the 20th century. A small little company that sold sandpaper. And this man, Dick Drew, was a dropout from college. He did a year of engineering, dropped out, and was a salesman for 3M for sandpaper. And he went around to the motor shops, and some of the people spraying cars at that stage, in the 1920s, two-tone cars had come into popularity. And they found that when they were spraying the car and they peeled away the paper with the tape, sometimes the paint came away, and then they had to respray the whole area of the car. And they said to this man, Dick Drew, is there anything you could do to improve the quality of the tape? He went back to 3M. He wasn't a scientist. He went back to the laboratory, fiddled around with different glues, and came up with a new glue, which was Scotch tape, and revolutionized the whole industry. He subsequently developed sellotape and subsequently developed your stick pads, peanut pads. Now that was just a salesman in 3M who revolutionized that company and how we all think about products. So you can do it too, if he could do it. Action. It's very difficult sometimes to take the appropriate action. And a short little puzzle. 3 frogs on a lily leaf in the pond. 2 of them decide to jump off. How many are left on the leaf? 2 decide to jump off. How many are left? Good.
They all stayed because they decided that they didn't do it.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
That's what I do.
Absolutely right. Decision and action are not synonymous. We all sit around at meetings, we make decisions. How many of us put it into action? And I think that's what's hugely lacking in life, is action. Next one is courage. Colonel Powell said, that courage is one of the most difficult virtues, because we all lack courage. And sometimes it's the courage with what might appear simple things. If you're in leadership, it might be getting rid of somebody from a job that's inappropriate. We very often will try and leave that person in their job even though we know that that's the right person, because we haven't the courage to face them and tell them. So we all need courage, but it's how we go about it is important. Humour. I'm a great believer, and it's one thing that we've always had in our lives, that at the end of a day, when I came home from work, we'd always try and share some bit of humour or a joke. There's a humorous episode in every day of our lives, and share that humour. Don't look at the negativity and the problems that have arisen. Try and look at the humorous side. Truth is, again, a huge element of leadership. If you're found out to be untruthful in any way in your life, it destroys your standing with anyone else. So you have to be absolutely truthful. And flexibility. I think again this comes back to Cardinal Newman's quote, "To live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often." Because within your lifetime you're going to have to change so often. The average person now will have 17 jobs in their lifetime. And I'm not advocating that you keep changing jobs, but that's a fact. The 10 most common jobs that are now available weren't available a decade ago. So we all have to change. Every single operation that I trained to do when I qualified is no longer applicable. So within your lifetime, you have to continually be prepared to change. The rate of change has accelerated. When you look back, horse and a plough, it took 600 years to go from a horse and a plough to an automobile. That was a long time. How long did it take to go from an automobile to the space shuttle? 60 years. So our rate of change and development is absolutely phenomenal, and you have to be able to change very quickly. Now the last area just to touch on very briefly is the role of the virtues. I think Mother Teresa's quote is very appropriate. God did not call us to be successful, but faithful. And I'm a great believer that the virtues, and I witnessed or sat in one of your classes on virtues, and I thought it was absolutely fantastic. That I think the virtues really should play an extraordinarily prominent role in your lives. Again, Cardinal Newman, nothing would be done at all if we waited until we could do it so well that no one could find fault with it. So don't be afraid to get up and do something, because if you're waiting for everything to be perfect, you'll never do it. This slide is the library in Trinity College in Dublin, one of our oldest universities, apart from Clonmacnoise that I showed you. But Trinity houses our most important national treasure, which is the Book of Kells. It's the 4 scriptures written on parchment. We don't know actually where it was written. Some say that St. Columba had some monks start it in Iona and they brought it back to Ireland. Others say that it originated fully in Ireland in the 8th century, but we don't actually know. But it appeared in Kells many centuries ago, and is an extraordinary national treasure. And I have a copy of it. They made a very limited edition of copies some years ago, and I'd like to give one to your president at the end of this talk, just so that he could have it in your library, and that you could all see what the monks did in those years. It's a phenomenal work. Finally, I think it's very important that you come to Ireland, share our heritage. I think that the St. Columkille's Institute in Donegal is a unique experience for young people, and I think what Professor O'Donnell and his faculty have done, and Cathy has helped him hugely, is a fantastic undertaking. It gives you a flair for our culture, but most of all, we need you to reinvigorate our youth in Ireland and to help us with converting them back to Catholicism, because so many of them have lapsed. And I see the great faith that you have here and how you can help, because we're so dependent on the American church. For years we sent missionaries all over the world. Every corner of the world had Irish missionaries. Now we need you back to help us in Ireland. And I think the St. Columkille's Institute will give you a little feel as to what's going on in Ireland, and we'd love you to come back and to partake, because I think not alone will you be immersed in our culture and history, but you'll understand us a lot better when you've been in Ireland. I just can't believe the Irish influence that's here in your institution. It just amazes me that so many people have Irish names and that so many people have been to Ireland. We're still only a little dot on the globe. But to me it's been a most wonderful privilege to have been here with you for the last 2 days, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, and I'd love to give this Book of Kells to your president.